Back when I was in my early 30s, for a very short time, I worked at a very small ranch in southwestern Montana. Having only worked at this ranch for around 19 or 20 months, we had our handful of issues. The biggest being something that you probably won't exactly believe me. So I'm just going to tell you. What the owner called them was buffalo wolves, if that's even a real thing. I had never even heard that name up until his mentioning of them. He thought they were some extinct form of wolves that have been around for a long time. But I guess this was actually a much more advanced species of wolf than I had ever come to know. I had seen them myself on several different occasions, tearing into livestock, being smart enough to manipulate parts of the fence to make it seamless, like they had never even crossed there, or even as far as covering their tracks, like a stealthy thief looking to break and enter in. All these things pointed to something other than a wolf, something far more advanced in intelligence, something far more human-like. Like I said, after having seen them myself, I know too much now. I don't claim to be an expert, but whatever you want to call them, buffalo wolves or what, these creatures are real, and they share far more many human-like characteristics than I'd like to think. For starters, I saw them clear as day, stand, walk, and live on two legs, just like a human being would, having no problems maneuvering or walking around, acting just fine. They also appeared to move down onto all fours, like that of a quadrupedal animal, again, having no problems ever shifting between one or the other. Also, in my mind, this presented an issue of balance. Most animals, I'd like to think, if not all, that walk on all four, simply can't walk on two. The balance of their body can't support two legs. But the way these animals' bodies were built, it was just so unnatural. Even the upper chest, the shoulders and the arms, looked far too human-like. Everything about this animal was wrong. I'm very fortunate that I have not had any personal run-ins, at least any that were up close or violent, thank the Lord. But the owner, on the other hand, had some personal accounts that he would never go into detail. He was always too scared to talk about it. Gee, I wonder why. Before I decided to sit down and write this, I thought I would educate myself, read up on other what they call Dogman encounters, or even through some of your episodes. And while after listening to many of them, I guess I should say that I'm surprised but not surprised by all the similarities that I too experienced. Like I had mentioned, the intelligence. But I didn't deal so much with the aggressiveness as many of the other people that you talk about. But instead of seeing livestock slaughtered, I witnessed them stealing them and taking them off into the north end of the ranch, where they were coming through the forest. What happened to the livestock? I can only guess they were eaten. But personally, I was never tasked with going out and finding the cadavers, or any remains. That was well beyond my pay grade. And I think the owner actually liked me, so he never wanted to task me with such things. I have no idea if he did himself. But any time that he knew these things were taken, or taking his livestock, he would just count that as a loss. He also seemed really apprehensive about doing any sort of self-defense against these animals, creatures, whatever you're wanting to call them. I don't know. Some sort of bio-anomaly, because I've never seen an animal that acted more like a human. I guess maybe if you think of an ape. But this was frighteningly smart. These things' overall ability to problem solve, think ahead, strategize, work in groups, and have a complete, actual understanding of the environment around them and how to work it to their good or their desire is just as frightening as it is admirable. I don't know if these creatures dwell in certain areas of the country, Or maybe they're just a West Coast anomaly. Maybe they live on the East Coast. But again, after listening to many encounters, reading many encounter stories, they seem to be everywhere. Not just in one part of the US, but even Canada, Europe, Australia, even parts of India, I take it. I'm not sure what they are. I would think that they are some sort of common species of unknown animal. But maybe animal isn't even a term we should refer to them by, just because of how much like us they are. But back to my writing. And this is something that I witnessed firsthand. There were two of them that I saw. A larger one and a smaller one. The larger one wasn't as big as the largest one that we had saw, which I believe to be the alpha male. This one, I guess you could call a medium-sized one, was roughly 6 to 7 feet in height. Pretty decent build. And the smaller one was probably closer to 5 feet, maybe a tad bit under. Much more slender in build. I don't know how much younger it was, which I'm assuming was younger. They were both running in a group. When the big one, or bigger one, stopped and noticed it left tracks on the ground, it quickly did a hand gesture to the smaller one, alerted it down to the ground, and they both began intelligently covering up their tracks. At least that's what I assumed they were doing, considering there was grass in the way, and the soil was soft. If you were to walk over there, you would leave tracks in it with your boots. Well, the very next day, there was no sign of any tracks being over there. My boots did leave a mark though in the soft soil. That's how I know, and that's how I came to the conclusion that they were marking up their tracks at the time. When I saw them do this the previous evening, I wasn't exactly sure what they were doing, until the next day, when I realized they were indeed covering up tracks. How they did it, I'm not sure, because even as I stepped back and kicked dirt over my own tracks, trying to replicate any way that they could to cover up the tracks, it didn't quite fully work, and I don't have a great way to accurately describe how to cover up soil, at least the way these things did. But I will say that being as large as they are, there is no way that they cannot leave tracks. I'm only 200 pounds soaking wet, and even I left a considerable impression in the soft soil with my boots. These things being much larger in density and mass, they had to know what they were doing. No animal I've ever heard of is able to go back and cover their own tracks. What kind of predators exactly are we dealing with? Well, my 19 or 20 months would be up, and I moved out of state, down to Northern California. I eventually lost contact with the owner, because I think he either moved or changed his number. I'm not sure. But I don't really want to go back to think about what he had to deal with. And we didn't really talk about the whole buffalo wolf thing a whole bunch. It was talked about sometimes and mentioned here or there. Enough that I guess you can consider it a topic at hand, but it was not a part of our daily activity or daily conversation. It was only brought up every once in a while, and very brief, if anything. Although there were conversations of concern here and there, enough that I knew they existed. After having seen them myself, I thought I would send this in to you and add in my 2 cents of my encounter with these dogman animals, or creatures or beings. I'm not sure what you refer to them as, but either way, I know they're out there. I know they exist, and who truly knows what they are capable of? This was back sometime in March or April of 2013. It was just beginning to get springtime, but not quite. It was still pretty foggy and rainy, but not freezing yet, or at least it was past the freezing part. I was on Facebook and got a message from a close friend of mine. I hadn't spoken to him in about over a month, and we were pretty decent friends. We would talk on and off. Anyway, he had a habit of randomly inviting me over for a little get-together or party, and I always gave in. This night, it was roughly 7:30. He shot me a message, asked me if I was available to come hang out with him and a few mutual friends of ours. I said yes, told me to be there around 9, in an hour and a half. I got ready, and he lives about 25 minutes away from me, a little bit out of town, where there's a lot less houses. Where his house is kind of up on a hill, surrounded by a bunch of trees. The front of his house is not like a typical driveway. It's kind of just dirt, with about 4, 5, or 6 cars parked out in front, and a really bright floodlight. You kind of pull off this dirty gravel road, right up to his house, and that's it. In the back of his house is a really large hill that kind of slopes down, where he has a large bonfire, and woods surrounding all of that. That's only relevant to include because, well, that's where we'd usually party and have fun, not having to worry about neighbors, since there were really none close by him, at least not for a half a mile in either direction. Now, going out to his house, everything was fine. It was a little foggy, but dark, somewhat clear skies, not rainy. I think it was a little wet, considering the time of year. I pull up to his house, and the floodlight comes on. As soon as I do, I see this large shape of a dog, the largest dog I've ever seen in my life, jump out from behind his Ford, right next to my car, off into the bushes. I was kind of freaked out. This thing easily was the size of a lion. You know, lions from Africa. Like a savanna lion, something that could easily pounce and kill you. I remember pretty clearly jumping out of my car and running to the back of his yard, just because I was so spooked. I told him, and I said, "Dude, you have a flipping lion in your front yard." And he kind of looked at me strangely and laughed, thinking I was already drunk or something. And I explained to him what happened. Him and his sister, and a couple of our other mutual friends who were already there, were curious, but they kind of laughed it off, thinking that I was either playing a prank or just joking around. I kept going on about how serious I was, and what I saw did indeed happen. Well, they paid no notion to that, and kind of went on doing their thing. As the night went on, we quickly forgot all about the whole giant wolf-dog thing that I saw. At least, that's what the shape looked like. A giant dog. I didn't see any details because it was so dark. And the floodlight that came on the front of his house, which by the way is super bright, only gave details to a large silhouette. As the night went on, probably closer to midnight, I had drinking a little, but I was only buzzed. My friend who invited me over was beginning to black out. He's a much heavier drinker than I, and although I enjoy it, I prefer social drinking more. I've never been a fan of getting drunk. I like a buzz here and there, like anyone else, but that's about where I stop. My other mutual friends, who had later on arrived, they were all getting pretty buzzed too, somewhere between there and drunk. That's when we started hearing noises off in the woods in the distance. Between the bonfire and the entrance of the woods, maybe 200 yards. It's pretty large open space. I mean, you could easily go ATVing. I think there were woods and trees around here at some point, but long before my friend bought the property, it was all cleared and torn out. So it's just a giant clearing. Well, we heard all sorts of crashing woods and noises, sounding like a large animal crashing through the trees, making all sorts of noises. I didn't hear any howling or any other animal noises, just the crashing sound, like something big trampling about. I'm trying to paint this picture for you. Imagine the Hulk, and put him in the middle of the woods in a dark forest at nighttime. Imagine the noise he would make moving around, pushing trees over, stomping around. You would probably guess that there's some sort of heavy machinery going around. Well, yeah, that's just how loud it was. Except there was no machinery sounds accompanying it. It was just crashing, thrashing. And while some of our friends were mildly concerned, I say mildly, because their state of inebriation took over more control than their actual sobering concern of what was in the woods. I was the only one that really began to get nervous, and this went on for quite a while, maybe close to an hour off and on, and then suddenly stopped, along with all the sounds of the night. Crickets, even the wind. It was dead silent. Now, it was about 1 or 1:30 in the morning, and most everybody but I was pretty drunk. So much so, they were able to ignore any eeriness that was felt in the air. Sitting out there in the quiet for maybe 10-15 minutes, I made the announcement that I'm going to go inside, lay down, and that they should all come inside with me, that we should put out the bonfire and put in a night. Some of them agreed, my other friend being so drunk that he was pretty much out. Whatever. I know it was probably a mistake, but I left him out there. 2/3 of us, I would say, decided to put out the fire and go in, while the other few sat outside, still talking. They came in at some point, but I had fallen asleep. Luckily, my friend had a pretty large house and a very large living room. Many places on the floor to crash. He had mattresses and pads all over, so it wasn't hard to find a spot to crash down on and lay on. I mean, he had his living room set up, so that way 10 or 15 people at a time could crash out. Pretty nice setup, actually, and it worked out in our favor. Not to mention the giant window panes all over the walls, meaning you could perfectly see out to the bonfire area and where all the woods was. Even though I was pretty creeped out and a little buzzed still, I decided I should try and fall asleep, and miraculously, I did. The next day, I had woken up. Everybody was inside. I was one of the first ones up, and decided I should head home. But I talked to my friend first, and asked him how things were going, and then I told him I was very uncomfortable the previous night. He said, when he got up to go back in the house, since he was one of the last ones, he told me he had this intense feeling like something or somebody was watching him. He had looked around, but not seen anybody. But he told me that this sounds weird, because it coincides with what I told him, but that he felt like something or somebody was watching him through the woods. I asked him could it have been neighbors who were coming over to try and maybe play tricks on us, but he told me no. The only neighbor, who lives about a half-mile away in that direction, is an elderly couple. There's no reason they would be going through the woods over to his property around 1:30 or later in the morning. For what reason? This couple was at least 80. I think the man was in a wheelchair even. There's no way or reason that would be a thing. Anyway, I know this is probably a dumb story, but my friend totally got the creeps. We never did figure out what that silhouette of the large dog was, or what the crashing sounds were in the woods, but I can't help but find it awfully fishy that weird stuff happened to not only me, but him as well, and we both acknowledged it. Everybody else, though, seemed to downplay it severely, like maybe they knew, but they really didn't want to know. Anyway, like I said, this was back in 2013. I've had no sort of experiences since then. It has really been the only thing that I've had that was weird remotely, and I've been out there many times since that day. Again, with nothing weird happening. So maybe it was a fluke. I'm not sure. Maybe we truly did encounter a dogman that night. We'll never know, I guess. I just hope that it never decides to come back. I'm really glad I found your channel, and while I've been debating about writing this into you, about the whole experience and wondering if it truly fits in with any of your stories, I thought, hey, why not? If you don't decide to use it, it is what it is. But if you do, I really hope your listeners can appreciate what I have to say. Now, let's back this up a little. The man in question is and was a good friend of mine. Up until around the end of 2016, died of a massive heart attack. Sometime before Thanksgiving, if I remember correctly. I'm not going to say his actual name, so I'll refer to him as Earl. Earl eventually found God, cleaned up his life, and became a pretty decent guy. But, pre-2000s, He was a bad guy to mess with. In and out of prison, sold and did a lot of drugs, did a lot of bad things, even murdered people. But his primary occupation was a pimp for at least 8 or 9 years. And during that time, he had some crazy stories that he shared with me. One being something about werewolves. Now, get this. So, at the time that him being a pimp, he ruled over, I guess if that's the correct terminology, a handful of prostitutes. He operated them in this really shady part of town, off in the outskirts, where it was a little bit more wooded, tucked away, but just as much a part of the city as any other part would be. Of course, with all the gang rivalry and gang banging, there would always be violence and, of course, drugs being sold. I should also clarify that if you're not familiar with slang, gang banging is not referring to an orgy, but actual gang activity, killing, violence, any sort of gang activity that you can think of, at least to my knowledge. While that was going around in plentiful amounts, there was also prostitutes going missing left and right. Now, on occasion this does happen. If you go to any major metropolis and you talk to any pimp, which I hope you wouldn't do, because they are dangerous men, but sometimes prostitutes are kidnapped. Sometimes they're killed. They are in a way seen as property of other pimps, so it makes sense that rival pimps would do this. But there was a horrible, horrible reason for this. Some of the prostitutes, who were friends with the other prostitutes, kept claiming that they would see this large black dog with tall pointed ears walking on 2 legs, which they would refer to as a werewolf, keep coming after the other prostitutes, attacking them, and eventually, multiple of these prostitutes would disappear. At least 5 of them in this same little area all vanished without a trace. Before truly finding out what was the cause of this, he ended up serving a prison term and getting out. And shortly after that, it was about at the end of his gang life, which would mean he turned over his life completely afterwards. So that was just a closed chapter. He never did find out. And I'm just telling you all this to give a backstory to the reasoning. He told me it always bothered him, and he found it weird, that his prostitutes kept referring to the same description of what they were seeing. Of course, he would beat them, mock them, force them to do stuff on him, as well as other people for more money, because he thought they were trying to get out of it. But he just now can't get around the fact that they would use the same descriptions, the tall pointed black ears, the fact that it looked, whatever it was, like a werewolf. He doesn't really believe in werewolves or anything like that. He's just more haunted that they would go missing, all saying that they saw this same creature or thing, and wonders if there's a reason behind that. I'm sorry I don't know as much information as I'd like to. I wish I would have talked to him more about it. But when he had shared it with me, I always found it very interesting, thinking at the time that the idea of a werewolf was a possibility. Now that I know about the idea of cryptids, and that they do exist, and the whole phenomenon with dogmen, I almost wonder if indeed that's what they were seeing. I should also state that this period of him prostituting these girls out was somewhere in the 90s. I think 1991 to 99 is to be exact, but I can't quite remember for sure, but it was sometime around there. And I also want to say too that the area these prostitutes served in was somewhere close by to Chicago. It wasn't a sect of Chicago if I remember right. It was a little bit past that, but still a busy area, just a little bit more forested than a big city. When I was 17, I used to hang out with my buddy, literally all the time during the summertime. We really had nothing else better to do. And I can distinctly remember one evening, we were bored. I think I had about $8 or $9, and I told my friend, hey, let's go walk to the store, get some Mountain Dews. Come back and we'll play video games. We did those things already, but for whatever reason, I was really craving a Mountain Dew then. I don't know why. So, he agreed, and we both walked down to the store. Now, the store was quite a bit of ways away, and you had to walk through this really sketchy long stretch of road that had thick woods on both sides. Being in California, at least middle to upper California, these were forests, like the kind of forest you see in the Pacific Northwest, not the shrubbery and loose woods that you see down in Southern California. I thought I should make that distinction. We had walked this stretch of road many times. I think it was a little over a mile, maybe a mile and a half. But we would go there often to get snacks, soda, and whatever stuff that a 17-year-old eats. Well, this time was really no different. And it being the summer evening, the sun was still out, and it was still beautiful weather. Active people walking their dogs, and cars going back and forth. It wasn't a dead road by any means, but there were fewer houses. I'm wanting to say all this stuff because I want to mention that this was a very lively area. Maybe not as lively as any downtown area, but there were people present, cars going by, as I just said. We were maybe halfway there to the store, when we heard strange noises off to the forest across the street. It made us both stop, look at each other, and question, what was that we had just heard? It sounded like a dog getting ripped apart, or something. Maybe like a cougar attacking a dog. I think after discussing it for a moment, that was the conclusion we came to. But it didn't quite sound like that, and living in California, I've had my fair share of hearing cougars, although I've only heard a few dogs, but this is exactly what it would sound like. So, we kept on walking, going back on our conversation of whatever it was we were talking about. Maybe 10 minutes later, we're now nearing the end of the walk, and we hear it again, except this time the noises are more distorted and closer, as if whatever it was following us parallel in the woods. This time, though, the sounds were different. It didn't sound like another animal attacking a dog or something. And when I mentioned it the first time, I mentioned the accompanying noises of a cougar making noise like a hissing sound, along with the whimpering and whining of a dog, even though they didn't sound quite right. Not like you'd actually hear. I know it's very hard to explain, but when we got near the end of the walk and we heard these noises again, they were different. It's almost like the sound of a dog and the hissing of a cat or something like that was overlaid on top of each other. It sounded very large and very distorted, like playing through a lo-fi radio or something. And whatever it was seemed to sound really big. Like, imagine a bison making that noise. Something of enormous size. It's really hard to describe accurately. My friend and I just kept looking at each other, like, what on earth is making those noises? There were some passerbyers on the other end of the street, a biker, and a lady walking her German Shepherd, all three of which, including the dog, made glances at the noises and seemed to carry on. The lady, if I remember right, even had her headphones in, and I remember that she looked over too, signifying that me and my friend were not indeed crazy, and we were hearing something strange and out of the ordinary. So here's where the story gets even crazier. We go to the store, and we both load up on Mountain Dew, since being 17, you seem to think you're really cool if you drink Mountain Dew. I'm really not sure what my obsession was at that age. So we're leaving, and we're about halfway back down this long stretch of road. Keep in mind, it's probably somewhere between 7 and 8, in the midst of summer. 7 or 8, I think. And it's still sunny out. Cars are still going by. There's still people walking. It's still lively. It's California after all. The noises begin to even get more violent sounding, if that makes any sense. It sounded like a flock of animals being ripped apart, minus the skin-ripping noises and blood and tissues being torn. I don't know how else to accurately tell you. That's what it sounded like. Like you would hear a roar, and overlaid with that roar was what sounded like distorted dog screams. I don't know. My friend, when we ended up getting back, said that he might think it might be a skinwalker. But I don't know. It didn't sound far off into the woods, and I had never even heard of a skinwalker before. He ended up telling me what a skinwalker was. He's not native, but he does have native friends, and has heard of what they are before. Except we were in California, nowhere near any reservation that I am or was aware of at the time. Well, come to find out later that night, people in that area had reported seeing a large, strange, upright canine figure in the area. I know this because he called a friend of his, or maybe it was a family member, one or the other, I can't quite remember, and they were talking about the weird noises that we had just heard a few hours prior. He got on the conversation over the phone, and since his friend, or family member, whichever it was on speakerphone, he didn't know he was on speakerphone, was talking about it, and saying that yeah, the whole neighborhood's kind of freaked out right now. They're not sure what it was. And I almost motioned to him, asking if he meant werewolf. My friend mentioned the word werewolves, and he said, nah, that's not what it was. It's something else entirely. Some strange animal, we don't know what it is. And then the rest of the conversation went as normal. And since then, I've always had this thing that I do believe that werewolves or animals like that exist somewhere. Maybe a skinwalker, maybe a werewolf, I don't know. Out here in California, though, I wouldn't put it past me that something weird is out there lurking in the darkness of the woods. My experience happened in the early fall of 2011. It was warm that year, and this happened right before Halloween. I was out walking at Douglas County Park with my boyfriend, and his friend and my youngest son, who was only 3 at the time. We walked back, past the cornfield, and worked our way to the bridge that crossed a creek just before you hit the heavy wooded area. I was tossing leaves in the creek on one side of the bridge, and Ethan would run to the other side to look for it floating downstream. I heard a series of loud knocks from the woods. I looked at my friends, and they heard it too. It was suggested that it was probably just other people out walking, so I shrugged it off. We began to walk back towards our car, because it was beginning to get dark. I heard a loud scream just then. It was nothing that I had ever heard before, too clear to be human, and too loud for a coyote. It did give me the creeps. My friends acted as if it was nothing, and we kept on walking. A few minutes later, I heard a loud scream again, only this time it was much closer. At that point, I picked up my son, looked behind me, and all I could see was tall grass. Nothing there. My friends even made a joke about it being a Bigfoot, and we worked our way back to the car. I have never in my life heard a yell like that before, and could not point it to any animal that I know of. For the record, it sounded nothing like the screams on the show Finding Bigfoot. It was loud, higher pitched, almost like a female scream, except without any strain to it. I believe that what I heard was indeed a Sasquatch. This happened almost 24 years ago now, but it has never left me in all these years, and I have never told anybody about these particular 2 incidents. The first incident happened when I was bow deer hunting during the early season. As I remember, that the leaves on the trees were actually still green. I had returned to my car that was parked in a nearby field and got my hunting gear all put away. I then sat in my car, waiting for about 10 minutes for my hunting friend to return, so that way we could finally go home. When he did not return, he did return after the incident. I got out of my car and walked down close to the edge of the woods, maybe about 10 feet or so from the edge of the woods. Shortly thereafter, I heard something coming from my left, just inside the wood's edge. It was making a lot of noise as it was walking through. I thought this was my friend coming back, but then I thought that this was very odd for my friend, since he was really quiet in the woods, as the walker was about right in front of me. I called out my hunting friend's name, to which I just received a rather loud guttural growl. But whatever the walker was, it did not break stride. It just kept right on walking rather loudly, away from me, going parallel with the edge of the field just inside the wood's edge. I've listened to it over and over again, the bipedal walking audio on the BFRO website. It sounded just like that, but add in some very loud branch breaking, and you'll be very close to what I heard that night. I'm 6'2", and when the walker did its loud guttural growl, when it was right in front of me, it sounded like it was about the height that my head was at. I would estimate that the place in the field I was standing at was about 2 feet higher than in the woods where the walker was at. The second incident that took place happened in the same location, roughly 200 yards from where the first incident happened about a week or so earlier. Both times I had been hunting from the ground. The hunting friend that was with me from the earlier time was also there, along with my sister's boyfriend. We split up with about 3 hours of hunting time left. It was pretty quiet for about the first hour, but then things began to change. I heard all sorts of noises, and I can't quite explain nor identify that happened in front of me from about my 10 o'clock position to roughly my 2 o'clock. I did see what appeared to be something walking into the thicker portion of the woods. This looked like the arms and legs of something going from the more open part of the woods to the more thicker part, and was about 40 yards away from my location. After seeing the arms and legs of whatever the things were, the tops of the smaller trees began swaying violently back and forth. This went on and off for about a half hour to 45 minutes. What really scared me was when the rocks began to be thrown in my direction. The size started out as about a golf ball size, and by the time that I turned tail, the size was about softball size. I would describe the color of what I saw of the arms and legs to be about a rather dark red to almost black, and that about wraps up both incidents. This was back in April of 2004. Our family has land just outside of Hatfield, towards Neilsville. We decided to take our camper up to the land and stay overnight with our 3 children. At approximately 2 in the morning, I woke up because I heard something walking around the camper. We are in a remote area in the woods, near a gravel road. The footsteps were right next to the camper. I was very still, but knew that my husband was also awake. I whispered to him, "Do you hear that?" He replied that he did, and it woke him also. He had hoped that it would not wake me. We were very still for a few moments, listening to the steps. This was a creature that was walking on 2 feet, as we could hear the crunching of leaves and twigs under its feet. We then decided to make some noise and see if we could scare away whatever it was. I flipped on the camper lights, and we both yelled for whoever it was to make themselves known, as we were armed. Nothing replied, but the footsteps stopped. We waited about 5 minutes, turned the lights off again, and waited. About 10 minutes go by, and the footsteps started up again. My husband went outside with his flashlight and weapon to take a look. Keep in mind, it is a really dark night, and we are set in the woods away from anyone who might be able to hear us if we needed help. Again, nothing. He came back in, and we settled down, again. 10 minutes later, the steps started up again. I know that this is something on 2 feet, that this is not afraid of us, but it clearly is not human. We decided to go out there with our own boys. my husband stood outside while I carried them into our minivan, and we left. We spent the night in the parking lot of a quick trip in Black River Falls. In the morning time, we went back to break the camper down and look around for traces of anything unusual. Because of the heavy leaf and pine needles covering the ground, we were unable to find any footprints. We looked at the camper, trying to determine if something was rubbing on it to make the sound. There was nothing there. As we were taking the camper down, I felt really creepy, like we were being watched. My father-in-law, several years earlier, told my husband that he saw a Bigfoot crossing Fisher Road on his way back to camp. He told my son that he thought he saw one in the woods while deer hunting also. My husband, while hunting when he was younger, found several deer carcasses in the woods, all piled on top of each other. At the time, they dismissed it as somebody hitting them with the vehicle and dragging them, for whatever reason, into the woods. Now when he looks back at it, he thinks they were far too away into the woods for somebody to drag in from the road, and the carcasses were picked clean. While we never saw anything, that I truly believe that we had a Bigfoot encounter regardless. I know that the creature walked on 2 feet and had a long stride. It came back over and over again. I wish we would have had a stronger flashlight. We only had a mag light on us. Now, we have a really high-powered flashlight in the event we need to look, for whatever reason, far into the woods. I've been back to that spot several times since, and my husband and his family hunt every year in that same spot. As far as we know, nobody else has had the same experience. I personally will never go back there and camp again. If they are as big as people say they are, they could have easily pulled my kids out of the camper through the canvas. My husband and I have jobs that require us to be honest and not embellish experiences. This was by far the most terrifying thing I have ever been through in my entire life. My mom and I were driving to my grandparents' house very early in the morning when we both saw what appeared to be a gorilla sitting in a field just a little ahead of us. As we got closer to the creature, we both said, "Oh my gosh, it's a Sasquatch." It was just sitting in the field with its back to us. This thing was humongous. She was probably going about 45 miles an hour, and our biggest regret has been, and always will be, not turning around to confirm our gut feeling. We did not see its face and or its whole body, just because it was sitting and facing the opposite direction. It was big, hairy and brown. Its head was oblong shape, and sort of came to a point, with no real definition between its head and neck, until its broad shoulders. Its arms were extremely long as well. They were so long that the hands were kind of bent beside its upright body. It was certainly not a bear. In fact, I would be willing to put money on that it was a gorilla before a bear. It was sitting on its butt, the same way that a person would. People have said that we were crazy for years, and will say that it was a bear and a misidentified sighting. But here's the kicker. The location where we saw the Sasquatch is not at all a prime bear location. After all, bears sitting on their butt versus a gorilla from behind look pretty different, and it would take somebody who has never seen either animal before to so easily misidentify it. We had a clear view on that day. There is absolutely no mistaking what we witnessed. My encounter takes me back while I was in college. This would have been in 1978, when I was in Ashland, Wisconsin. While bow hunting with a friend, deep in the wilderness, I took to sitting high in a tree, overlooking thick briars. Out of the still and silence of the wilderness, an animal, unknown to me, came barreling through the thickest vegetation imaginable. It was thrashing about and shrieking at the highest pitch possible. I was simply frightened to death and could only stand to try to see it. I could not see it, but did see the brush being shaken. Again, the shrill sound of its voice filling the air. It was awesome to hear. Scary, but awesome. My friend, who at the time was hunting down for me, did see it, and it was on two legs, and appeared what he would describe as ape-like to him. We were both too afraid to stick around, and never went back. We went to an environmental college, and I shared this with one of my professors. He had never heard of a local animal making that sound. That's my story, and I often tell it about 12 times a year. Good luck researching it. This particular incident happened a long, long time ago, and I never told too many people about it. I'm a 31-year-old Native American, and at the time, I was maybe 6 or 7. I'm glad to know that there are people like you who take this seriously. It was night, and my sister and cousin were playing around on the phone. They would dial our number and hang up the phone so it would ring. You know, the way kids do. They had music playing loudly, and were just playing around, being kids. The doorbell rang. One of us answered the door, but nobody was there. Well, this happened 2 more times. We had a little house dog, and we also had a Saint Bernard. And my sister and cousin noticed that the house dog was crouched under a chair in our living room. The last time the doorbell rang, we all went outside and couldn't see anybody around, since we were all standing out on the porch. It was maybe a half hour later. My oldest brother went to the refrigerator. The rest of us kids were playing in the hallway when he came running down the hallway with his hands on his face, crying hysterically. He ran in our parents' room, jumped on the bed, landing on his stomach. He was crying pretty badly. We all kept asking him, prodding what was wrong, and he finally told us what he saw. He said that he saw something peeking around the tree. He said it was motioning to him, like come out. That's when he freaked out. After about 15 minutes, him calming down some, there was a knocking at the back door. And the way they were knocking, it was like an open the door now kind of knocking. When we opened the door, it was a guy who lived just a few houses away. He came in and was white as a sheet and was shaking pretty bad. He said he broke down a ways from our place, and when he was walking up the road, he heard something walking in the woods with him. He didn't know what it was. He said he was just really glad to see our lights on. Our parents weren't home, mother working. Father didn't know where he was. But we ended up calling our uncles who lived next door to us. They arrived a few minutes after we called them, and they had their shotguns with them. They came and talked with a guy that came to our house. I think one of my uncles even took him home. There was 6 of us kids home. One was our cousin. My uncles went outside to look around, and my oldest sister and our cousin wanted to go outside too. Well, when they opened the back door, our Saint Bernard, let me tell you, for the size of those dogs, the dog would not let those girls out. He even growled at them. Well, my sister and cousin backed up from the door, and as they did that, the Saint Bernard came running into the house. My sister and cousin still went outside, and as they were standing by this little trail right by the house, they both noticed some dark form at the bottom of the hill or trail. They thought it might be a stump, but then the stump moved and turned to look at them. My cousins said it had red eyes. They came back inside right away. Our cousin went out again through the back door, went around the house to the front, and when she got to the corner of our house, she looked up towards my uncle's garage and said she saw something peeking just around the garage. She said that she thought it was one of our other cousins, but she noticed this had a cone-shaped head as it looked around the garage towards our house. They ended up putting us kids to bed, the three of us. My sister and I were pretty scared, and our little brother, he had a crib, didn't really know what was going on. My sister and I were literally shaking in bed. Our brother's crib was right next to the window. We were really hoping that whatever was out there didn't come to our window. Well, we did see a big figure go by. We were just so scared. It seemed like forever ago when our parents got home. When they did, we told them what had happened. My mother ended up calling a spiritual guide, and he had told her that there was probably 3 of those things around the house that night. He also told her that they were looking for a boy to take. He said that one of them may have lost one of their own and came looking for a young boy to replace the one they had lost. I had spent the summer with my sister and her family. Prior to starting the new school year, my family came from Oak Park, Illinois, to get me and spend a few days with my sister. Myself 12, my brother 10, and my 2 nieces, whom were 5 and 7, were at a swing set at the edge of the woods, swinging, talking, cutting up, and being kids, playing. I don't know why, but for some reason, we all just stopped, turned around at the same time. Standing about 10 feet from us was a very large ape-like animal. In plain view, nothing was near him at all. It was about 8 feet tall, covered head to toe with a medium brown hair, except the face area, which looked similar to a chimp's face. It had a widow's peak at the hairline and very black eyes. Very muscular, about 2 foot thick, from back to chest, and very long arms. At this young age, I had never even heard of Bigfoot. It was looking over its left shoulder and looking me directly in the eyes. All of us just froze and looked at it for a few seconds. Then, at the same time, we all took off in one direction as it took off in another. We ran to the house and told everybody we just saw a monster. But of course, they just laughed at us. It was a year later that my brother found a book on Bigfoot. That's when we knew what we had really encountered that day. Many days I have wondered how something like that, something that big, could have gotten that close to us, and whatever it was intending to do. Although it was not aggressive, and its reaction was the same as ours, to run, we didn't go outside much after that, especially knowing that thing was wandering around. I was telling a longtime friend about a Bigfoot sighting a common friend of ours had related to me. He said, "You know, I saw something several years ago." He went on to say that he was fishing on the Sioux River near Big Rock in Bayfield County, as he had for nearly 20 years now. He was upstream, where the river crosses Big Rock Road. He was walking along the bank, and on the way back, focusing on his footing as he had chest waders and carried his rod. He looked up as a black animal, 3 to 4 feet tall, on the next bend in the river, roughly 70 feet ahead of him, seemed to do the same at the same time. He watched it as it immediately launched itself away from him, arms outstretched, and a blur. It moved so fast. It cut into the water at least 10 feet into the river, made a splash, and then disappeared underneath the water. He watched and waited at least 3 minutes for it to surface, but it never did. He thought about going to the sandbar that it was originally on, just to check for tracks, but would have had to back travel several bends in the river, cross, and then bushwhack all the way on the opposite side. He was already sweating and decided to just walk on out to the car. He said, "I can just kick myself for not going back to check." But in hindsight, maybe it was better he didn't. Also, back in 1976, at the time I was with 3 college friends at the intersection of 236 and 241, maybe 6 or so miles as the crow flies, stopped the car to get out for a break, and heard a very non-human, high-volume, single scream come from the right out of the woods. Went on an afternoon hike and decided to stop at the clear cut, where big power lines are, just to see if I could see a deer or something. I jumped up numerous turkey and deer while hiking. So, I parked the car, rolled down the windows, shut the car off, and just listened and watched. Not even 10 minutes go by, and this large black thing just starts walking across the open, all the way to the other side. I get out of the car to get a closer look to see it. As soon as I do, it sees me, then steps into the tree line. I hurried back to my car and watched from the cab. I called an individual on the phone with them while I'm still watching it. At first, before I began recording, I noticed it, and for a second, I thought a hiker, maybe a hunter. But its posture and how it moved did not look right. To me, it looked hunched over, like its shoulders were rolled forward. I showed a buddy, and he agrees with me. So, I don't know. I found a dismantled deer very close by. The head was missing, and the front legs were ripped off. In fact, there was a document sighting on the BFRO, about 1 mile or so from this location. I have a video of the subject and photos of the deer. I was very close to the Shoal River, thick tie-dye swamp very close by. On Tuesday, November 26th, 2013, I was driving south on Highway 151 from Madison, Wisconsin, going back to Iowa after seeing a concert at the Red Zone, which ended roughly around 11:30 p.m. My wife was laying down and trying to get some sleep in the back seat of the car, since she had to work early the next morning. Normally, I work night shift, so I had no problem staying awake to drive home. The oncoming traffic on the highway was spaced about 1 car for every 3/4 of a mile to a mile, with some farther apart, so I couldn't really use my high beams. I am a former Iowa police officer, so I have a habit of periodically looking at the mile markers along the road, so that if I have to call for help, I can give a better idea of where we are at. I would say about a half mile or so after coming around the large curve southwest of Mineral Point, which I believe to be about mile marker 36, I was in the outside lane, and I passed a large black figure standing upright on 2 legs, where the grass meets the gravel on the inside shoulder of the median on my left. The headlights never hit it directly as I approached, but the outside area of the light lit it up as I passed it. I'm 6'2", and I was clearly able to see the body from the ground up to the shoulder. I would estimate the shoulder height to be around 6'6" or 6'8", with the angle of the light beam and how low the car sits to the ground. It looked like the head was shadowed by the shoulder, so I was unfortunately not able to see its face. The distance between us was roughly 15 feet when I passed by. I was able to see its hand hanging down along the thigh, and it was a lighter color and not midnight black like the color of its body. The thickness of its body, looking from the side, its back to its chest, was about 2 feet thick. The fur or hair was hard to see in the distance, and the light conditions and the speed of the car. I had my cruise set at around 65 miles an hour, but it was short. I thought to myself, what was that? Even though I know what it was, I didn't just see that. My immediate physical reaction was extreme anxiety. My chest tightened, and I made excuses to myself to not stop and look at it. From what I saw, I had no desire to stop. A couple miles passed while I tried to overcome the fear, and then I realized I need more facts on the conditions of the sighting. I also felt that it was trying to cross the highway from the south, and that's why I didn't see it up ahead in the headlights. Until this event, I was always open to the possibility that they exist, but was never a big believer. My tune has now changed, and I don't care to ever see one again. It was in the late evening time, and I just let the dog outside to do her thing before bedtime. She immediately started barking, constantly with alarm. I went outside, and my horses were all lined up, staring down the roadway. That's when I heard this weird noise. It was very loud, kind of a cross between a scream and a growl. It did several times. I went in the house to get my husband to come out and hear it. He came right, but the noise had just stopped. He, however, did see how alert and nervous the horses were, and how the dog was scared and barking. We stayed outside quite a while, but heard nothing more. Several days later, also in the evening, I took the ATV to go close my gate at the end of my driveway, which is about 3/4 a mile away. As I went around the curve, I seen a large, widespread pair of eyes. I slowed, but did not stop. I continued down the hill, and I could feel the hair go up on the back of my neck. Of course I had to go back up. I seen nothing on the way up. I told my husband about it. The next day, I went down to the spot where I had seen the eyes before, and I saw no tracks looking over the edge of the bank. But I figured whatever was there had to be roughly 8 feet tall to put the eyes at the height they were, and be standing on the ground. There is a spring in the ditch line. The bank is very steep, and I choose to not go down to investigate. I went to the BFRO to check if there were any reports for Iowa County and Wisconsin. At the time, there was one near Dodgeville, roughly 30 miles away. I have thought of this several times in the past year. I've only had 2 other people that have been on my farm in the woods, and that they have said they've heard something like nothing they have ever heard before out there. I did not share my story with either of them, but I told them that they weren't the only ones to hear something. Tonight, I was watching the Bigfoot show, and I thought I would get on your website and check things out again. Well, guess what? I know exactly where a witness lives, and it's probably 5 miles away from me. I never heard anything about it until I read it. I probably won't call them, but if I see him, I'll have to share my experience. As always, thank you.